Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing the brand new Gearwrench PivotForce Pliers. Now they have these in two separate varieties, which both of them are right here. One is a diagonal cutter and one is a long nose cutter. And what they basically have come up with here is a way to allow you to use a lot less force and cut through the exact same materials. What I'm going to do is compare in this video how these cut compared to a normal set of pliers. And you're going to see how much more force that I need to put in with a standard pair versus the PivotForce. Now recently I had to redo a little bit of wiring in the garage and I ran some standard 12-3 wire, and first I wanted to, just for argument's sake, try to use the standard pair, and I had a real tough time cutting through it. Typically I'll use something like channel lock cable cutters, but because I got these in, I wanted to try them out for the video, I instead used the PivotForce. And with the PivotForce, even though they look identical, I was able to use roughly about half of as much force, and I was able to snip right through the wire and it didn't hurt my hand at all. So now I'm going to show you some closer views of these, and then we're going to see them actually being used. Now to give you a little closer view of what that PivotForce actually means. Basically there's two pivot points with the PivotForce pliers, right here and right here. So as you open it up, they are both basically hinges, and if you watch the handle is going to open at twice the rate of the actual end of the cutter itself. So what that's doing is allowing you to apply a lot more force onto the cutting surface, and you'll be able to cut through the materials a lot easier. Now with a standard pair of pliers, you can see there's a center pivot bolt, and what that does is allow you to basically use all your force to cut through the actual material, in this case a wire. So as you watch the opening over here, this side is going to open up at exactly the same speed because there's only a center hinge bolt there. And then with the PivotForce, you can see the two separate pivot points, and that will allow you to add a lot of extra leverage in on your cut. Okay, here's some standard 12-3 house wire. And first I'm going to cut through this with the Gearwrench PivotForce diagonal cutters, and you'll watch how little force that is actually needed to cut through this. Now these are three different strands inside of here, and just watch my hand. It'll cut it no problem at all. Now using a standard pair of diagonal cutters, I'm going to try that same exact cut. These are the same length, and I'm going to squeeze down as tight as I can squeeze, and I'm actually going to have to use two hands, and I'll try to cut these wires. And there they go. It was at least twice as much force using the standard pair versus the PivotForce. Now I'm going to move on and use the long nose, which are basically long needle nose pliers. I'll do that exact same cut, one-handed, snips it right off, no problem. Now we're going to use a standard pair of needle nose pliers with a cutter in the center. We'll try to cut those wires once again, squeezing down. I can't do it with one hand. Now we'll see if two hands can do it. And two hands was able to do it, but it was probably more than twice the amount of force needed. Now if you're an automotive technician, you know a very standard use of the diagonal cutters is going to be to remove cotter pins from ball joints and tie rod ends. So here's a quick example to show you how easily these can cut through a cotter pin. Basically you'll just line it right up, squeeze down, and it's going to cut right through it. But using a standard pair that you're not getting that additional leverage with a larger cotter pin is basically next to impossible. Squeezing down on this with even two hands barely was enough to cut through it. And then if you use a standard size, this is pretty standard size cotter pin for a ball joint or a tie rod end. I'll show you the difference in cutting through this size. Now using the PivotForce pliers, we'll squeeze through it with very minimal force. It's going to cut the end right off. And then using the standard pair, we're going to cut exactly the same way. I'm really having to squeeze down. And once again, I'm having to use two hands to finally get the job done. So that's another quick example, if you're an automotive technician, how these could benefit you simply for the fact that you can put a lot more force and leverage on the cutting surface, and you're letting the pliers do the work for you. Now for the final two things that I'm going to cut through that will actually show you the amount of power that you're going to get out of the PivotForce pliers versus a regular pair. The first is going to be just some standard galvanized steel strapping. And what I'll do is I'll use the PivotForce pliers, and it's going to clamp down on here perfectly evenly across the cutting surface, and it's actually going to cut this right off, which is really amazing for something other than a set of tin snips. So trying that same test with a pair of standard pliers, we'll clamp down on it. Once again, one hand is not going to do anything, and I'll try two hands. Even with two hands with full force, it is not cutting through that, and I can go right behind it with the PivotForce pliers, clamp down, and it's going to cut it right out of the way. Now, as impressive as that is, I really think the most impressive test is going to be this coated steel cable. This is similar to what you would use with a dog tie-out, and typically you need a pair of bolt cutters or something to cut through this, simply for the fact it's steel, and most cutting surfaces would ruin cutting this with a standard pair of pliers. So using the PivotForce pliers, I'm going to take this steel coated cable, place it in them, close it, and it's going to cut the end right off. So these will cut through steel cable, which is absolutely amazing to me. And then once again, using the standard pair of pliers, we can clamp down on it, and the most we're getting is slight crimping. So even if we move this back and forth, it's not going to do anything. But once again, we can go right behind it with the PivotForce, and it will cut it right out of the way. So now you've seen the brand new Gearwrench PivotForce pliers for yourself. Now, when I first took these out of the package, I got to be honest, they were a little bit stiff. So what I did when I took them out, I just kept working them back and forth until basically everything worked in together, maybe 30 seconds of just moving them open and closed. And then they were a lot more easy to use, because when I first took them out, like I said, they were very stiff, and I was kind of skeptical. But now that I've used them, and you've seen for yourself how easy they cut through that wire, and there's no pain in my hand, and I didn't have to put nearly the amount of force into it, I actually think these are a real good idea. If you like this video, please click like. If you like my channel, please click subscribe. And thanks for watching.